I went on a solo camping trip deep in the Appalachians. I'd been wanting to do a trip like this for years, completely alone. No phone, no distractions, just me and nature. I planned a 4-day trek through a stretch of national forest I'd never been to before. I had my gear, my maps, my food, everything planned down to the smallest detail. I thought I was ready. The first day was perfect. The hike in was quiet, the air crisp with that late October chill. The leaves had turned, and the whole forest was a mix of orange, red, and gold. I made it about 8 miles in before setting up camp near a creek. There was no one around. I hadn't seen another person since I left my truck at the trailhead. Just me, the trees, and the sound of running water. That night, I slept like a rock. Woke up to the sun filtering through the trees, feeling refreshed, excited for the next stretch. I packed up and hiked another 10 miles, deeper into the forest. This part of the trail wasn't well traveled. The path was overgrown, barely visible in some places. By the time I set up my second camp, I felt like I was the only person for miles. The first strange thing happened that night. I was in my tent, reading by headlamp, when I heard something outside. It wasn't an animal. I know what deer and raccoons sound like. This was deliberate, slow, careful footsteps moving around the edges of my camp. I turned off my light and listened, heart hammering. The steps stopped. Silence stretched on for so long I started to think I imagined it. Eventually, I fell asleep. The next morning, I found footprints in the dirt around my tent. Human footprints. They weren't mine. The treads didn't match my boots. My stomach dropped. Someone had been out there walking around my camp while I was sleeping. I told myself it was just some lost hiker. Maybe they saw my fire and came to check it out, then left. That made sense, right? I kept going. The third day, the trail was almost non-existent. I had to keep checking my map and compass to make sure I was still on course. The silence out there was different, thicker, like the forest was holding its breath. I started getting this nagging feeling that I was being watched. That night, I built my fire bigger than usual, hoping the light would keep whoever was out there away. I sat up, scanning the trees, gripping my knife so tight my fingers ached. I didn't hear anything this time, but I couldn't shake the feeling. My skin crawled like there were eyes on me, just out of sight. I barely slept. Every little noise had me snapping awake. The wind through the trees, a branch cracking in the distance, my own breathing. The first light, I packed up and started moving fast. I was supposed to stay one more night, but I decided to hike straight back to my truck. 23 miles in one day would be brutal, but I didn't care. I just wanted to get out. About 5 miles from where I camped, I found something that stopped me cold. A little clearing just off the trail. In the center, a pile of bones. Not animal bones, human bones. Cleaned, picked dry. A skull sitting right on top. Empty eye sockets staring at me. I ran. I don't know how long, how far, but I ran until my lungs burned and my legs felt like they would give out. I didn't stop to rest. Every snap of a branch, every rustle of leaves had me whipping my head around. I felt exposed, like at any second something was going to reach out from the trees and pull me in. By the time I reached my truck, it was almost dark. My legs were shaking so badly I barely managed to climb inside. I locked the doors, started the engine, and peeled out of there like the devil himself was behind me. I didn't stop until I hit the nearest town. I checked into a motel, locked the door, and sat under the shower until the water ran cold. I called the police, told them everything. They sent a couple of officers to meet me. I showed them on the map where I'd been, described what I found. They said they'd send someone out to check. They never found it.
No bones. No clearing.
Nothing. I know what I saw. I know it was real, but they looked at me like I was crazy. One of them even suggested I was dehydrated, imagining things. I haven't been back in the woods since. I don't think I ever will. I don't think I'll ever go camping again. Not after what happened last summer. It was supposed to be a quiet weekend in the woods, just me and nature. But things went wrong in ways I still can't fully explain. There were no ghosts, no monsters, just the kind of horror that comes from knowing how close you can come to death when you're completely alone. I picked a spot deep in the mountains, far from any towns or even other campsites. That was the whole point. I wanted to be isolated, away from noise, away from people. I found a stretch of dense forest near a small, slow-moving river. The trees were thick, their branches intertwined like fingers, and the air smelled of pine and damp earth. It was perfect, or so I thought. The first day went fine. I set up my tent near the river, got a small fire going, and spent the evening cooking a simple meal and listening to the distant sounds of the forest. Birds, insects, the occasional rustle of something in the underbrush, normal stuff. I went to sleep feeling relaxed, completely unaware of what was coming. I woke up in the middle of the night to the sound of something moving outside my tent. Not just moving, pacing. Heavy, deliberate footsteps circling around me. I held my breath, listening. It wasn't an animal. I've been in the woods enough to know what a deer or a raccoon sounds like. This was different. 2 feet. Slow. Purposeful. My skin prickled. I grabbed the knife I always keep in my tent and sat up as quietly as I could. The footsteps stopped. Silence stretched so long I started to wonder if I had imagined the whole thing. But then, just as I was about to lie back down, I heard it again. Closer this time. The sound of a foot pressing into dirt right outside my tent. Whoever it was, they were standing just inches away from me, separated only by a thin sheet of fabric. I didn't move. My heart pounded so hard I thought whoever was out there would hear it. I waited and waited. Then, just like that, the footsteps retreated. Slow at first, then fading into the distance. I stayed up the rest of the night, knife in hand, listening. But nothing else happened. By morning, I convinced myself it had been an animal after all. Maybe a bear walking on its hind legs. Maybe a trick of my tired mind. I forced myself to shake it off and went about my day, hiking and gathering firewood. I refused to let fear ruin my trip. But something about the forest felt different. The silence felt heavier, like the trees were holding their breath. That night, I built a bigger fire and made sure my knife was within reach before going to bed. I told myself it was just paranoia, but deep down I knew better. Sometime in the night, I woke up again. This time there was no sound, just an absence. The usual chirping of insects, the rustling of small animals, gone. The forest had gone completely silent. If you've ever spent time in the woods, you know that's not normal. Nature doesn't just stop. The silence pressed in on me, making my skin crawl. Then came the breathing. Soft, steady, just outside my tent. Slow inhales, slow exhales. I froze. It was close, closer than before. I couldn't see anything in the pitch black of my tent, but I could feel it. Presence. Someone standing just outside, breathing, listening. I gripped my knife so tightly my fingers ached. The breathing continued for what felt like hours. Then, just as slowly as it had started, it stopped. Silence stretched around me again. I stayed awake until dawn, muscles locked, barely even blinking. When the sun finally came up, I forced myself out of the tent. There were no footprints, no signs that anyone had been there. But I knew what I had heard and I wanted to pack up and leave. But something inside me resisted. Pride, maybe. Stubbornness. I had planned for a 3-day trip, and I wasn't about to let fear cut it short. So I stayed. I forced myself to act normal, but the feeling of being watched never went away. Every time I turned my back, I felt eyes on me. Every rustling branch made my pulse spike. By the time night fell, I was on edge, exhausted but unwilling to sleep. Then the worst thing happened. I had been sitting by the fire, staring into the flames, when I heard a sound that made my blood turn to ice. My own voice. From somewhere in the trees, I heard myself whisper my own name. My breath caught in my throat. My whole body turned rigid. The voice came again, just a little closer. My own voice, whispering my name, drawn out, like a taunt, like a dare. I jumped to my feet, knife in hand. My fire crackled, casting flickering shadows all around me, but I couldn't see anything beyond the light. My ears strained, waiting. Then silence. Nothing moved. Nothing breathed. I don't remember making the decision to run, but suddenly I was grabbing my pack, stuffing it with whatever I could reach. My hands shook so badly I could barely zip it shut. I doused the fire, grabbed my flashlight, and started down the trail, heart hammering. I didn't care if it was the middle of the night. I was getting out, and I walked fast, too fast, tripping over roots and stumbling in the dark. My flashlight beam bounced wildly. I didn't look back. I didn't want to see. Then, about a mile from my campsite, I saw it. A figure, standing in the middle of the trail, facing me. My flashlight caught only glimpses. A body tall and thin, clothes dark and indistinct. No face, just a black void where a face should be. I stopped. My breath came in sharp gasps. My mind screamed at me to run, but my legs locked in place. The figure stood motionless, watching, waiting. Then, slowly, it took a step forward. Something in me snapped. I turned and ran, crashing through the trees, not caring if I made noise, not caring where I was going as long as it was away. Branches whipped at my face. My lungs burned, but I didn't stop. I didn't look back. I don't know how long I ran. Time blurred. All I know is that eventually, I burst onto a dirt road, a road I didn't even remember seeing on the way in. And by some miracle, headlights appeared in the distance. I ran into the middle of the road, waving my arms like a madman. The truck skidded to a stop. The driver was an older man, eyes wide as he took me in, covered in dirt, scratched up, shaking. I don't even remember what I said to him, only that he let me into the truck and drove me the hell out of there. I never went back, never even looked up that area on a map. I don't want to know what I saw, what followed me in those woods. I just know that I'll never go camping again. Some things you don't need answers for. You just need to survive. I had been planning the camping trip for weeks. Just a solo weekend in the middle of nowhere, away from the noise, away from people. I needed it. My job had been running me into the ground, and I was tired of the endless routine. I wanted to wake up to silence, the sound of the wind through the trees, the crackle of a fire, nothing else. No stress, no deadlines, just me and nature. I picked a spot deep in the forest, far from any campsites, a place where no one would bother me. It was an old trail, barely used, but it led to a small clearing by a lake. I had found it on an old map online and marked it as my destination. It was supposed to be perfect, secluded, peaceful. The first day was normal. The drive was long, but I liked that. It gave me time to clear my mind. When I finally arrived at the small dirt road that led into the woods, I felt a sense of relief. I parked my truck, grabbed my gear, and started walking. The air was crisp, the forest was quiet, and the deeper I went, the more relaxed I felt. It took me about an hour to reach the clearing. The lake was smaller than I expected, but beautiful. The water was still, reflecting the sky. Trees surrounded the area, their leaves barely rustling. I set up my tent near the water, gathered some firewood, and made a small fire as the sun started setting. I ate, stared into the flames, and for the first time in months, I felt at peace. That peace didn't last long. The first thing that felt off was the silence. The deep woods are never truly silent. There are always birds, insects, the occasional rustling in the bushes. But that first night, it was too quiet. The kind of quiet that makes your skin crawl. At first, I told myself it was normal. Maybe the wildlife here was just different. Maybe they settled down early. But the more I sat there, staring into the darkness beyond my fire, the more uncomfortable I felt. The air seemed heavier. I felt watched. I convinced myself I was just being paranoid. It was my first solo trip this deep into the woods, after all. It made sense that my mind was playing tricks on me. I forced myself to ignore it and eventually crawled into my tent, making sure my knife was within reach before falling asleep. A snapping branch woke me up. I sat up instantly, my heart pounding. The fire had burned low, casting faint flickering shadows against the tent walls. I listened. The forest was still dead silent. Then another sound, something moving through the trees, slow, deliberate. Not the random scurrying of an animal, but something heavier. I held my breath. The footsteps stopped. I stayed still for what felt like forever, waiting, listening. Nothing, just the wind. I told myself it had to be a deer, maybe a raccoon, but the feeling in my gut told me otherwise. I didn't sleep well after that. Every little sound had me on edge, but the rest of the night passed without incident. Morning came, and the uneasy feeling still clung to me. I made breakfast, walked around the lake, tried to shake it off. The sun was bright, the trees swayed lazily. Everything looked normal, but I couldn't shake the feeling. That's when I noticed the footprints. At first, I thought they were mine, but the more I looked, the more I realized they weren't. They were bigger, wider, and they weren't fresh. I could see that the edges had softened, like they had been there for a while. But here's the thing, they weren't there the night before. I would have noticed. I had walked this area, checked the ground. Someone had been here. I tried to stay calm, but my hands were shaking. Could have been an old hiker's tracks, I told myself. Maybe someone had been here weeks ago, and I just didn't notice last night. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. I decided I'd stay one more night. I wasn't about to let paranoia ruin my trip. I had a rifle in my truck, but I hadn't brought it with me to the campsite. I figured a knife and some bear spray would be enough. Now I regretted that. The second night was worse. I kept my fire bigger, hoping it would keep whatever was out there away. But again, the silence settled in, thick and unnatural. I sat by the fire, listening, waiting. Then, just past midnight, I heard it again. Footsteps, closer this time, slow, deliberate. My breath caught in my throat. I grabbed my knife, standing up, trying to pinpoint where the sound was coming from. My fire cast flickering shadows, making it hard to see beyond the trees. I could feel my pulse in my ears. Then something moved at the edge of the trees. Not an animal, person, just standing there. I couldn't make out a face, just the outline of someone standing between the trees, watching, not moving, just there. I didn't call out. I didn't want to know what would happen if I did. Instead, I did the only thing I could think of. I grabbed my flashlight, turned it on, and aimed it directly at them. Nothing. No one was there. My stomach twisted. I know what I saw. There was someone there. But now, there was only darkness and trees. I didn't sleep that night. I sat by the fire, knife in hand, waiting for the sun. Every so often, I heard movement, branches snapping, leaves rustling, but I never saw anything again. As soon as the sky started turning pale with morning light, I packed my things. I moved fast, not caring about breakfast, not caring about anything except getting back to my truck. The walk back felt longer. Every sound made me jump. The feeling of being watched never left me. When I finally reached my truck, I nearly collapsed with relief. I tossed my gear into the back, jumped in, and locked the doors. Then, as I started the engine, I saw it. A single muddy handprint on the driver's side window. Not mine. I never went camping alone again. I had planned the hike for weeks. I wanted to go alone. Not because I was antisocial, but because I needed the quiet. Life had been too loud lately. Work, city noise, endless notifications on my phone. I just wanted a break from everything. So, I picked a trail that wasn't too popular. One that stretched deep into the mountains, far from any town. A full 2-day hike in 1 night camping, then a 2-day hike back. The first day started smooth. The air was crisp, and the smell of pine and damp earth filled my lungs. I felt alive. My pack was heavy, but I was used to it. My boots crunched against the dirt, and the occasional bird chirp made me feel at ease. The deeper I went, the more peaceful it became. No cars, no people, no distractions. Just me and the trail. By midday, I stopped at a creek to refill my water bottle and eat some trail mix. I checked my map. The route was straightforward, following the ridgeline before dipping into a valley where I planned to set up camp. No cell service, but I expected that. I had a GPS device just in case. As I hiked on, I noticed how empty the forest felt. No wind.
No rustling.
Just dead silence. I told myself it was normal, but something about it felt off. I shook the feeling away and kept moving. By late afternoon, I reached the valley. It was beautiful, thick trees, soft ground, and a clearing perfect for setting up camp. I pitched my tent, gathered some firewood, and as the sun set, I cooked a simple meal over my stove. The silence still bothered me, but I tried to ignore it. I was just overthinking things. That night, I woke up to a sound. Not an animal noise, not the wind. It was a click, like a small rock being knocked against another. I held my breath, listening. It happened again. Click, then silence. I sat up slowly, heart pounding. My flashlight was within reach. I grabbed it and clicked it on, shining it outside my tent. Nothing, just trees and darkness. I told myself it was probably a small animal. A raccoon, maybe. I forced myself to lie back down, but I barely slept. Morning came and I felt stupid for being so paranoid. I packed up quickly, ready to keep moving. The next section of the trail led through dense forest, climbing towards a higher ridge. As I walked, I noticed something strange. Small rock piles along the side of the trail, stacked carefully, not natural, like someone had placed them there. I stopped, looking around. The silence was back. No birds, no wind, just stillness. A chill ran through me. I tried to brush it off and kept walking, but my mind was racing. Had someone else been out here? I hadn't seen a single person since I started the hike. Who would bother making rock piles in the middle of nowhere? I pushed on, climbing higher. The further I went, the more uneasy I felt. The trees seemed wrong, too still, too quiet. Then I saw it, a set of footprints in the dirt. Not fresh, but not old either, and not mine. Someone had walked this trail recently. My stomach tightened. I wasn't alone. I kept moving faster now. My plan was to reach the next clearing by noon, but my nerves were getting to me. Every noise, every shadow made me jump. Then, around a bend, I saw something that made my blood run cold. A backpack, torn open, stuff scattered around, clothes, a ripped sleeping bag, a broken tent pole, and no sign of the owner. I stood there, frozen. My instincts screamed at me to turn back, but I was deep in the trail now. If I turned back, I'd be retracing my steps through whatever had caused this. If I went forward, at least I'd be heading towards civilization. I decided to move forward. I forced myself past the abandoned gear, my senses on high alert. Every step felt heavier. The ridge was steep, but I pushed on, lungs burning. Then, just as I reached the top, I saw something ahead that made my heart hammer in my chest. A figure, far down the trail, just standing there. Not moving, just watching. Couldn't make out details. They were too far, but they were real. Person, out here in the middle of nowhere, standing in the middle of the trail. I didn't know what to do. My body screamed at me to run. But where? If I ran back, I'd be going towards the abandoned gear, towards whatever had happened back there. I took a step forward. The figure didn't move. I took another. Still nothing. My pulse pounded in my ears. Then I blinked, and they were gone. I stood there, breathless. My brain couldn't process what I'd just seen. There was nowhere to go, nowhere to disappear to that fast. But the trail ahead was empty. I didn't waste another second. I walked as fast as I could, not running. Running would make noise. I wanted to be silent, invisible. For the next hour, I moved nonstop, checking behind me every few minutes. Nothing. The forest stayed silent, but the fear never left. By the time I saw the first sign of a ranger station, I almost collapsed from relief. I stumbled towards it, hands shaking. When I got inside, I told the ranger what I'd seen. The abandoned gear, the figure, the silence. His face darkened. He listened carefully, then nodded. "We'll send someone to check it out." That was it.
No shock, no disbelief.
Just a nod, like he'd heard it before. I left that day, never looking back. But something tells me that whatever is out there, in that forest, doesn't want to be found. And whoever left that backpack behind never made it out. I should have turned back the moment I lost the trail. It started as an ordinary solo hike. I had picked a remote trail deep in the mountains, one I had found on a blog about lesser-known hiking routes. It was supposed to be a quiet, challenging route with great views at the top. I packed light but enough to be safe: water, a few protein bars, a small first aid kit, and my GPS watch. I made sure my phone was fully charged before I left, though I knew I wouldn't have service for most of the trip. The first few hours went smoothly. The trail was narrow but clear, winding through thick trees and steep inclines. The deeper I went, the more isolated I felt. I hadn't seen another hiker since I left my car, but that was expected. I liked the solitude. That's why I hiked in the first place. About 3 hours in, I noticed something strange. The path, which had been well-worn and obvious, started fading. Grass and small bushes covered parts of it, as if no one had walked here in a long time. I checked my GPS. It still showed I was on track. Maybe the blog was outdated. Maybe this route wasn't as popular as it used to be. I kept going, pushing through the overgrowth. The air was thick with the smell of damp soil and pine. The deeper I went, the harder it became to tell where the trail was. My GPS said I was close to the peak, but the trail markings, small ribbons tied to trees, were nowhere to be found. Then I saw it. A single shoe. It was old, torn, and half buried in the dirt. My first thought was that someone had lost it. But as I looked around, something felt off. The way it was placed, the way the laces were tangled like it had been yanked off in a hurry. I shook it off and kept moving. The trees were denser now, and the sky had turned a dull gray. The sun was starting to lower. I hadn't reached the peak yet, but I decided to turn back. It wasn't worth getting stuck out here after dark. That's when I realized I didn't know which way to go. The overgrowth had swallowed any sign of a trail. The trees all looked the same, and my GPS, which had been tracking my route, showed a jumbled mess of lines. I took a deep breath. I had trained for this. Stay calm, retrace your steps, look for landmarks. But nothing looked familiar. I walked in one direction for 10 minutes, but the more I walked, the deeper the forest seemed to stretch. I turned back, trying another path, but I ended up at the same spot with the shoe. Panic crept in, but I pushed it down. I pulled out my phone, no service. I tried my GPS again, but the screen flickered and went black. The battery had been at 60% just minutes ago. I still had my compass. I knew the general direction of my car. If I kept heading west, I'd hit the main trail eventually. But the deeper I went, the more the terrain changed. The ground was uneven, covered in thick roots and loose rocks. At one point, I slipped, scraping my palm against a jagged rock. Blood smeared across my hand, but I had no time to care. I needed to get out. Then I heard it, a rustling sound, close, too close. I stopped, holding my breath. The forest was dead silent except for that sound. Something was moving. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't an animal scurrying through the underbrush. It was deliberate, heavy footsteps. I turned, scanning the trees. Nothing, but the sound had been there, just behind me. I wasn't alone. I moved faster, nearly tripping as I pushed through branches and thorns. My breathing was loud, too loud. Every few steps, I stopped to listen. The footsteps would start, then stop when I did. Someone was following me. I couldn't see them, but they were there, moving when I moved, stopping when I stopped. I swallowed the panic rising in my throat. I needed to lose them. I picked up my pace, not running. Running was dangerous on uneven terrain, but walking fast enough that my legs burned. The forest was thick, but I forced my way through. Thorns tore at my arms, branches whipped against my face. I didn't care. Then, up ahead, I saw something. A small clearing, and beyond it, what looked like an old structure. An old cabin. It looked abandoned, the wood dark with age, windows either broken or missing. The door was slightly open. I hesitated, but I had no choice. If I was being followed, I needed cover. I ran inside and pushed the door shut, pressing my back against it. Silence. Then, footsteps. Right outside. I held my breath, heart hammering in my chest. The footsteps stopped just beyond the door. Whoever it was, they were right there. Minutes passed. My legs shook, but I didn't move. Slowly, I peered through a crack in the wall. Nothing, just trees and shadows. Then movement. A figure standing just beyond the tree line. I couldn't see their face, but they were tall, unmoving, watching. I stayed there until the sky darkened completely. The figure didn't move. I had to get out. I couldn't stay here all night. I gripped the small knife I carried, more for comfort than defense. Then I made my move. I sprinted, straight through the trees, in the direction I prayed was west. I didn't look back. Branches clawed at me. My lungs burned, but I kept going. The sound of footsteps behind me was quick, but distant. Then a road. A real road. A dirt service road, but a road nonetheless. I ran until my legs gave out. I collapsed onto the dirt, gasping for air. A pair of headlights appeared in the distance. A truck. I stumbled to my feet, waving my arms. The truck slowed, then stopped. The driver, an older man, got out, looking concerned. "You okay?" I nodded, too breathless to speak. He looked me over, saw the scratches, the torn clothes. "Come on, let's get you out of here." I didn't look back as we drove away. I didn't want to see if something or someone was still standing in those trees. I never found out who it was. I never found that trail again, and I never hiked alone after that. I checked my watch. 4:17 p.m. I still had about 2.5 hours of daylight left. That should have been enough to make it back down to the trailhead. It had to be enough. I had started my solo hike early that morning, my backpack loaded with essentials: water, protein bars, a light jacket, my pocket knife, and a small first aid kit. I had mapped out my route in advance, an out-and-back trail leading up to a ridge with a stunning overlook. The total round trip was supposed to be about 10 miles. I had done longer hikes before, so I figured this would be a nice, challenging but manageable trek. I was wrong. The first half of the hike had been uneventful. The trail was well marked, winding through dense pine forests, gradually ascending as it followed the natural contours of the land. I passed a couple of hikers in the early hours, exchanged polite nods, and then found myself alone with the sound of my boots crunching against the dirt. The solitude was refreshing at first, peaceful. I reached the ridge around 1 p.m. The view was breathtaking. Rolling hills stretched for miles, their peaks softened by distance. I sat down on a flat rock, pulled out a granola bar, and took my time soaking it all in. There was no rush, at least that's what I thought. Then, as I started my descent, things went wrong. The first mistake was missing a turn. I don't know how it happened. One moment I was on the trail, the next I was pushing through thick underbrush, trying to relocate it. My GPS wasn't helping. The tree cover was too thick, and my phone's compass was bouncing between different directions. I wasn't worried at first. I had a good sense of direction. I had hiked alone before, but the more I walked, the more uncertain I became. I wasn't seeing any familiar landmarks. No blazes on trees, no well-worn path, just endless forest stretching in every direction. I doubled back, hoping to retrace my steps, but somehow, that only made things worse. The second mistake was ignoring my gut. I should have stopped and tried to get my bearings properly. Instead, I kept moving, convinced I could figure it out. The ground was getting uneven, sloping downward. That was bad. I knew the trail had stayed relatively level after the ridge. If I was going downhill too much, it meant I was heading the wrong way. I stopped and took out my map, tried to match the contours of the land to what was on paper. But maps can't show you the real feel of a place. They don't capture the density of the trees, the way the light shifts as the sun gets lower, the eerie silence that settles in when you're truly alone. And I was alone, completely. The third mistake was wasting daylight. By the time I admitted to myself that I was lost, the sun had dropped lower than I liked. I could already feel the temperature changing. The warmth of the afternoon was fading, replaced by something sharper, colder. I picked a direction and walked. It wasn't random. I tried to follow the incline, hoping it would lead me back up toward the ridge, where I might be able to spot the trail. But the ground was uneven, littered with fallen branches and hidden rocks. My progress was slow, and then I heard something, a snap. I froze. It was close, too close. A branch breaking underfoot, an animal, person. I scanned the trees, my pulse hammering. Nothing moved. The forest was deathly still, except for the distant rustling of leaves in the breeze. I took a careful step forward. Another sound, this time behind me. My mind raced through possibilities. A deer, maybe. A bear? No, there would have been more noise, more movement. A mountain lion? I reached for the pocket knife in my pack, though I knew it wouldn't do much good. I kept walking faster now. My boots crunched over dry leaves, but I wasn't focused on my own sounds anymore. I was listening, straining. Then I saw it. Not a person, not an animal. A structure, a small wooden cabin, half hidden between the trees. No smoke from a chimney, no sign of life, but it was old, weathered. The windows were dark, the door slightly ajar. I hesitated. Every instinct screamed at me to stay away, but I had no choice. I needed shelter, needed to stop and figure out my next move before nightfall. I approached slowly. The air around the cabin felt different, heavier, the silence deeper. I pushed the door open just enough to peer inside. Empty, dust-covered furniture, an old wooden table with a single chair, a rusted stove in the corner. No sign of recent use. I stepped inside. The floor creaked beneath me. The walls seemed to press in. I swallowed, ignoring the growing unease curling in my gut. I needed to stay put for a moment, just long enough to check my map again. maybe even wait until morning when I could navigate better in the daylight. Then I saw them, boot prints in the dust, fresh, not mine. I turned and bolted, out the door, into the trees, my heart pounding so hard it felt like my ribs would crack. I didn't care about direction anymore, only distance. I ran until my legs burned, until my breath came in ragged gasps. Finally, I stopped, bracing against a tree, chest heaving. I listened. Nothing. I forced myself to keep moving, slower now, more careful. The light was almost gone. I couldn't afford another mistake. Then, miraculously, I found it. The trail. A real marked trail. Not the one I had originally taken, but a path nonetheless. Relief hit me like a wave. I followed it. Walked for what felt like hours. My legs were numb, my fingers stiff with cold. But eventually, finally, I saw the glow of headlights in the distance. The parking lot. My car. I didn't look back. I don't know who was out there. I don't know who left those footprints in the dust. But I do know one thing, next time I won't be hiking alone. I never liked the woods at night. There was something about the way the trees swallowed the light, the way the silence wasn't really silent. But I didn't want to be the guy who backed out of a camping trip at the last second. So I packed my gear, threw it in the truck, and drove out to meet the others. It was supposed to be a weekend trip. Just me, a few buddies, and nothing but nature. We picked a remote spot, deep in the forest, miles away from the nearest town. No cell service, no roads, no people. Just trees, dirt, and the occasional rustling from animals we hoped were harmless. We set up camp near a small clearing, close to a narrow river. The first day was normal. We pitched our tents, gathered wood, and started a fire before nightfall. The air smelled like damp earth and pine, and the sky was endless, stars flickering between the gaps in the trees. We cooked some basic meals, drank a little, and talked about nothing in particular. It felt good to be away from everything. Then came the night. The fire died down, and we all climbed into our tents. I lay awake, listening to the sounds of the forest. The usual things, branches creaking, leaves rustling. But there was something else, something that didn't fit. It wasn't an animal, at least not one I recognized. It was movement, slow and deliberate, like footsteps. Not heavy, but not light enough to be a small creature. Something was outside. I told myself it was nothing, just paranoia, my mind playing tricks. But then I heard it again, closer this time. A shuffle of dirt, the snap of a twig. My stomach tightened. I held my breath and listened harder, but whatever it was had gone quiet. Too quiet. I don't know how long I stayed awake, but at some point, exhaustion took over. Morning came, and I woke up feeling like I hadn't slept at all. The others were already moving around, making breakfast, joking about who snored the loudest. I almost forgot about the noises. Almost. We spent the day hiking. The deeper we went into the woods, the more unsettling it felt. Something was off. I kept glancing over my shoulder, expecting to see someone standing between the trees, but there was never anything there. Just an eerie stillness that didn't belong. The second night was worse. Started the same fire, food conversation. But this time, when we turned in for the night, I felt it before I heard it. That sensation of being watched. My skin crawled, every instinct screaming at me that something was wrong. Then came the sound, closer than before. A slow, steady crunch of footsteps on dry leaves. I gripped the flashlight next to me and waited. The steps circled the tents, pausing every few seconds. I could hear my heartbeat in my ears, feel the sweat on my palms. I wanted to wake the others, but I didn't dare move. Then, as suddenly as it started, the sound stopped. Morning came, and I forced myself to brush it off. Maybe it had been a deer. Maybe my mind was making it worse than it was. But then we found the footprints. Not animal prints, not even boots, bare feet, dozens of them, around our tents, near the fire pit, even by the trees where we had stored our food. Some prints were small, others larger. None of us could explain it. We laughed it off, but it wasn't real laughter. No one wanted to admit how wrong it felt. The third night was the worst. We agreed to keep watch in shifts, but exhaustion got the better of us. At some point, I must have fallen asleep because I woke up to the sound of something scratching against fabric. My tent. I stayed still, barely breathing. The scratching moved, slow and methodical, from one side of the tent to the other. Then it stopped. A few seconds of silence. Then a whisper. Not words, just the faintest breath of sound, too low to make out. I grabbed the knife I kept in my pack, my hands shaking. Then the tent fabric bowed inward, like someone was pressing a hand against it from the outside. My body went rigid. I wanted to scream, but no sound came out. Then it was gone. I waited until the first light of dawn before unzipping my tent. The campsite looked the same, but the footprints were back. More this time, closer. That was it. We packed up and left within the hour. No one argued. No one joked. We didn't speak at all until we were miles away, back on paved roads where the world felt normal again. I don't know what was out there. I don't want to know, but I'll never go back. I had been planning this solo camping trip for months. Life in the city had been draining me, and I needed a break. Just me, the woods, and silence. I picked a remote national park, somewhere deep where few people went. I wanted isolation, and I found the perfect spot. A small clearing near a lake, miles away from the nearest marked trail. I packed light but made sure I had the essentials: tent, sleeping bag, food, water, and a satellite phone just in case. The first night was peaceful. The air was crisp, the scent of pine filling my lungs. The only sounds were the occasional rustling of leaves and the distant hoot of an owl. I set up my tent, made a small fire, and ate a simple meal. It felt good to be disconnected, away from everything. The second day, I decided to explore the area. The lake was beautiful, untouched. I followed a small stream that led deeper into the woods. It was mid-afternoon when I found something strange. A rusted-out pickup truck, half buried under fallen branches and leaves. It had been there for years, long enough for the forest to start reclaiming it. The doors were gone, the tires deflated, and vines had grown through the broken windows. Inside, there were old beer cans, a moldy sleeping bag, and something that made my stomach drop: a single hiking boot covered in dirt. I stood there for a while, staring at the truck. How had it gotten here? There were no roads for miles. Maybe an old logging trail that had disappeared over time? But the boot, it looked like someone had just left it. I felt uneasy but shook it off. People leave things behind all the time. I took a few pictures with my phone and headed back to my campsite. That night, something changed. I woke up suddenly, heart pounding. The fire had gone out, and everything was silent. Too silent. No wind, no crickets, nothing. I strained my ears, listening. Then, faintly, I heard it. A crunching sound, like footsteps on dry leaves. It was slow, deliberate. My tent was zipped shut, but I could see the faint outline of something moving outside. My heart pounded in my chest. A bear? A deer? But something felt off. I reached for my flashlight, hand shaking. Slowly, I unzipped the tent an inch, just enough to peek out. The fire pit was barely glowing, casting a weak orange light. At first, I saw nothing, just trees and darkness. Then my eyes adjusted. A figure stood at the edge of the clearing, half hidden behind a tree. Not an animal. Person. I froze. They didn't move, just stood there, watching. I couldn't see their face, just the outline of a body, tall and thin. My mind raced. Who the hell would be out here in the middle of nowhere? No one knew I was here. I didn't move. I barely breathed. Minutes passed and they didn't move either. Then, slowly, they stepped back into the darkness. Gone. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. As soon as the sky started turning gray, I packed up my stuff, shoving everything into my bag as fast as I could. I needed to get out. I didn't bother eating. I doused the fire and started hiking back the way I came. Every few minutes, I stopped listening. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed. The forest was different now. The trees felt closer, the path unfamiliar even though I had just walked it yesterday. The quiet was overwhelming. I forced myself to move faster. My legs ached. My breath came in sharp gasps, but I didn't stop. Then I saw them again, up ahead, standing in the middle of the path. Closer this time. I didn't think. I turned and ran. I had no plan, no idea where I was going. I just ran. Branches tore at my clothes, my backpack bouncing on my shoulders. I ran until my legs burned, until my lungs screamed for air. When I finally stopped, I had no idea where I was. The trees all looked the same. I was lost. Panic crept in. I took out my map and compass, trying to figure out my position, but my hands were shaking too much. I forced myself to breathe, think. I had my satellite phone. I could call for help. I reached into my bag, empty. My phone was gone. I don't remember dropping it. I had it when I left camp. Had I lost it while running? Or had someone taken it? The realization sent a cold wave through my body. I wasn't alone. Someone was out here with me. Someone who didn't want me to leave. I had no choice but to keep moving. I picked a direction and walked, forcing myself to stay calm. Hours passed. The sun was setting. I needed to find shelter before dark. Then, in the distance, I saw it. A cabin. Old, abandoned looking, but real. Place to hide. I ran toward it, pushing through the undergrowth. The door was unlocked. Inside, it smelled of damp wood and rot. Dust covered every surface. There was a broken table, a rusted stove, and a single chair in the corner. But what caught my eye was the back wall. Dozens of photographs pinned haphazardly. All of people, hikers, campers. Their faces were blurred, their eyes scratched out. My stomach twisted. I stepped closer. One of the pictures was of me. A fresh Polaroid taken last night. Standing by my fire, my blood turned to ice. The sound of footsteps outside snapped me back. Slow, deliberate. I had to move. Now, I didn't stop running. I ran until my legs gave out, until my body refused to move. When I finally collapsed, I could see the lights of a ranger station in the distance. I made it. I never got answers. The police searched the area but found nothing. No cabin, no photographs, no footprints. Just an empty forest. They chalked it up to exhaustion, maybe a bad fall, maybe I imagined it. But I know what I saw. I haven't been camping since. I had been planning the trip for weeks. I wanted to escape the noise of the city, just for a few days. Work had been stressful, and I needed some peace. A solo camping trip in the mountains seemed like the perfect way to clear my head. I chose a remote area, somewhere far enough from the usual tourist spots. The less human noise, the better. I packed all the essentials. Tent, sleeping bag, enough food for a few days, a knife, a small hatchet, and a basic first aid kit. My backpack was heavy, but I didn't mind. The drive took about 4 hours. The last stretch was a dirt road, winding through dense forest. My car struggled over the uneven terrain, but I finally reached the spot I had marked on my map. There was no sign of anyone else. Just me, the trees, and the sound of the wind moving through the branches. I took a deep breath. This was what I needed. I set up my tent near a small clearing, not too far from a river. The The sun was starting to dip behind the trees by the time I finished. I gathered some wood and started a fire. As the flames crackled, I sat on a fallen log, eating a simple meal of canned beans and jerky. It was peaceful. As darkness settled in, I lay inside my tent, listening to the sounds of the forest. I heard the occasional rustling in the bushes, probably just small animals. I had no reason to worry, but something felt off. It wasn't anything obvious, just a feeling, a slight unease I couldn't shake. I tried to ignore it and closed my eyes. Sleep eventually came, though it was light and restless. I woke up in the middle of the night. The fire had died down, and my tent was completely dark. It was silent, too silent. I held my breath, listening. There was a faint sound, something moving in the underbrush. Slow, deliberate, not the random scurrying of an animal. I reached for my knife, my fingers tightening around the handle. The sound stopped. I stayed completely still, every muscle tense. Minutes passed. Nothing. Maybe it had been my imagination. I let out a slow breath and forced myself to relax. Eventually, I drifted back to sleep. The next morning, I stepped out of my tent, stretching. The air was cool and fresh. But then I saw something that made my stomach tighten. Footprints. Not mine. They were just outside my tent, leading from the treeline to where I had been sleeping. Barefoot. Human. I swallowed hard, my mind racing. I had been alone when I set up camp. I was sure of it. I scanned the trees, but there was no sign of anyone. Whoever had been here was gone. I forced myself to stay calm. Maybe it was just some hiker who got lost and passed through. But deep down, I knew that didn't make sense. What kind of person walks through the woods at night, barefoot, without saying anything? I checked my supplies. Nothing was missing. No signs of anything being disturbed other than the footprints. I considered packing up and leaving, but I had driven for hours to get here. I had planned for days. Maybe I was overreacting. I decided to stay. The day passed without incident. I hiked, took some pictures, and tried to enjoy the quiet, but the unease never fully left me. That night, I built my fire bigger than before. I kept my knife close as I sat near the flames, listening to the night sounds. Again, I had trouble sleeping. Every little noise made me tense, but nothing happened.
No strange sounds. No footprints.
By the time the sun rose, I felt a little foolish. Maybe it had been nothing after all. I decided to stay one more night, just to prove to myself that I wasn't being paranoid. That day, I went down to the river to collect some water. The air was cool, and the sound of the running water was soothing. I knelt down, filling my bottle. Then I noticed something on the opposite bank. A figure, standing between the trees, watching me. For a split second, my mind refused to accept what I was seeing. It was a man, tall, thin. He wasn't wearing a shirt, and his skin was pale. His face was hard to make out in the shadows, but I could feel his eyes on me. I froze. Then, just as suddenly as I had noticed him, he stepped back into the trees and disappeared. I didn't wait. I grabbed my things and hurried back to my campsite, my heart pounding. I packed up in record time, shoving everything into my backpack with shaking hands. The entire time, I kept looking around, expecting to see him again, but I didn't. I hiked back to my car as fast as I could, barely stopping to catch my breath. The whole time, I felt like I was being watched. When I finally reached my car, I threw my gear inside and locked the doors. My hands were shaking as I started the engine. As I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror. The dirt road stretched behind me, empty, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I had been lucky, that if I had stayed one more night, I might not have made it out at all. I haven't been camping alone since. I don't know why I agreed to go camping alone. I told myself it would be peaceful, a way to clear my mind. No distractions, no noise, just me and nature. But now, sitting in my tent in the dead of night, I realize I made a terrible mistake. The trip started fine. I packed everything I needed: tent, sleeping bag, food, water, flashlight, extra batteries, even a knife. I chose a remote spot deep in the woods, far from any campsites or trails. The drive took hours, and then I had to hike another mile to reach the spot I had picked from a map. It was perfect, secluded, surrounded by trees, next to a small, calm lake. I set up camp, gathered wood, and built a fire as the sun went down. Everything felt right. The first sign that something was wrong came just after dark. I was sitting by the fire, eating a granola bar, when I heard something move in the distance. It wasn't just a rustling of leaves or the snap of a twig. It was a deliberate sound, slow and careful. I held my breath and listened, but it stopped. I convinced myself it was a deer or some other animal. That's normal in the woods, right? I didn't sleep well that night. Every small sound made my heart race. The wind moved the trees, the lake made soft splashes, and somewhere, an owl hooted. I kept my knife close, telling myself I was overreacting. Eventually, exhaustion won, and I fell asleep. The next morning, I woke up to something strange. Around my tent, the ground was disturbed, as if something had walked around it during the night. Not just an animal, though the footprints were human. I stared at them for a long time, my stomach twisting. The prints weren't mine. They were bigger, heavier, and led from the woods to my tent and then back into the trees. I told myself someone must have been passing through. Maybe a hunter, maybe another camper who got lost. But deep down, I knew that didn't make sense. I was miles from any trail, and the footprints led straight to my tent, as if someone had been standing there watching me sleep. I tried to shake it off. I packed my bag for a short hike, planning to explore the area. But as I walked, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I kept stopping, listening, glancing over my shoulder. Nothing, just trees and silence. But my gut told me something was off. About an hour into my hike, I found something that made my blood run cold. A pile of rocks, stacked neatly in a formation that didn't look natural. It was like a marker, a sign. Nearby, hanging from a tree, was a small bundle of sticks, tied together with twine. I don't know why, but I felt like it was meant for me, like someone had left it there. I turned around and went straight back to camp. I didn't run, but I wanted to. Every step felt heavier, and the trees felt closer. When I reached my tent, I started packing up. I wasn't going to stay another night. Something was wrong, and I wasn't going to wait to find out what. Then I noticed something else. The firewood I had stacked was gone. I had piled it neatly the night before, but now it was scattered. Some pieces were missing entirely, and there, in the dirt, more footprints. Fresh ones. Someone had been here while I was hiking. I grabbed my bag, slung it over my shoulder, and started walking. I didn't bother packing my tent. I just left it. I wanted to be gone. The hike back to my car felt like the longest walk of my life. Every sound made my pulse jump. Every shadow felt like it was hiding something. When I finally reached my car, I felt a wave of relief until I saw the scratches. Long, deep scratches running along the driver's side door. Not from an animal. They were too deliberate, too clean, like someone had dragged a knife or a sharp rock along the metal. I didn't stop to think. I got in, locked the doors, and started the engine. As I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror. Standing at the edge of the woods, just barely visible between the trees, was a figure. I couldn't see details, just the shape of a person standing still, watching. I didn't stop. I didn't look back again. I drove until I reached the highway, then kept going until I was miles away. Only then did I let myself breathe. I don't know who or what was out there, I don't know why they watched me or what they wanted, but I know one thing for sure. I'll never go camping alone again. I should have never gone camping alone. That thought has been burned into my mind ever since that night, and no matter how much time passes, I can't forget what happened. I wasn't inexperienced. I had camped alone before, hiked difficult trails, even spent days in the wilderness with nothing but a backpack and a knife. But nothing prepared me for that night. It started as an ordinary trip. I had planned to spend 3 days deep in the forest, away from people, away from everything. Just me, nature, and the quiet. I wanted to clear my head. The stress of life had been weighing on me, and I figured a few nights under the stars would do me good. I picked a spot about 10 miles from the nearest road, far off any major trails. I wanted solitude, and that's exactly what I got. The hike in was uneventful. The forest was thick, but I had a GPS and a map. I had picked my campsite carefully, a small clearing near a creek, surrounded by tall trees. It was perfect. I set up my tent, built a fire, cooked some simple food, and just sat back, enjoying the silence. The only sounds were the wind in the trees and the occasional rustling of small animals in the underbrush. It was peaceful. The first night was normal. I slept well, only waking up once when a raccoon scurried too close to my tent. I had tied up my food in a tree, so I wasn't worried. By morning, everything was as it should be. I spent the day hiking around the area, exploring, fishing a little. It was exactly what I needed. But that changed on the second night. As the sun dipped below the trees, I got that strange feeling, the kind that makes the hair on the back of your neck stand up. It was sudden, like a switch had flipped. I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was just my mind playing tricks. But it was hard to shake. The woods felt different. The air felt heavier, and the usual sounds of the forest seemed distant, muted. I forced myself to go about my normal routine. I built a fire, made some food, and sat by the flames, trying to enjoy the moment. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. My instincts screamed at me, but there was no reason for it. Then, just past midnight, I heard it. At first, it was faint, a crunching sound, like someone stepping on dry leaves. I told myself it was an animal, maybe a deer. But then it came again, closer, more deliberate, the sound of someone walking. I held my breath, straining to listen. My fire was still burning low, casting flickering shadows on the trees. My tent was zipped shut, but I hadn't gone inside yet. I grabbed my flashlight and slowly turned it in the direction of the sound. Nothing. The woods were empty, but the feeling of being watched was unbearable. I stayed still for what felt like forever, listening, but the footsteps didn't come back. Eventually, I convinced myself it was just my nerves. Maybe a branch had fallen. Maybe a small animal had moved through the underbrush. Either way, I was too tired to keep sitting there, so I crawled into my tent and forced myself to sleep. I woke up suddenly in the middle of the night. My fire was completely out. The air was freezing. But that wasn't what woke me up. It was the sound. Breathing. Not mine. It was right outside my tent. Slow, steady, deliberate. I didn't move. I didn't even breathe. My heart pounded in my chest, and my body felt frozen. I listened, hoping, praying that I was imagining it. Then something pressed against the side of my tent. Not an animal. Not the wind. Something solid. A hand? A foot? A body? I don't know, but it pressed in just slightly, then pulled away. I wanted to scream, but I stayed silent. I reached slowly for my knife, gripping it tight. My mind raced with possibilities. Who was out here? No one knew where I was. I had picked this spot specifically to be alone. The breathing continued, deep, steady, terrifying. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. The silence was deafening. I stayed like that for hours, gripping my knife, unable to sleep, unable to move. When the first light of dawn finally crept through the trees, I unzipped my tent as quietly as I could and stepped outside, scanning the area. Nothing. No footprints, no signs of anything. But something was off. My food bag was gone. Not just fallen. Gone. The rope was still tied to the tree, but the bag had been cut down. The knot was cleanly sliced through. I felt sick. No animal did that. Someone had been here. Someone had been watching me. I packed up my things as fast as I could, constantly checking my surroundings. I had a long hike back, and I didn't want to stay a second longer than I had to. The entire hike back, I felt it. That sensation of being followed. Every time I stopped to rest, I listened. I never saw anyone, never heard anything else. But I knew. I could feel it. I made it back to my car just before sunset, threw my gear inside, and drove off without looking back. That was the last time I ever camped alone. I don't know who was out there that night or what they wanted, but I do know one thing. They were watching me, and they weren't in a hurry to leave. I never should have gone on that trip. I don't know how else to start this. I guess I thought I needed some time away, to clear my head, to be alone for a bit. I had been dealing with too much work stress, personal problems, and just life piling up on me. I figured a few nights in the woods, away from everything, would help. I drove out to a spot I had researched online. It was deep in the forest, a place that wasn't too popular but still had some trails and campsites. It was about a 4-hour drive from my home, and the further I went, the fewer cars I saw. By the time I got close, it felt like I had left the rest of the world behind. Just thick trees on either side of the road, the occasional dirt path leading off into the unknown. The campsite itself was just a small clearing. There was a fire pit made of old stones, some fallen logs around it for seating, and enough space to set up a tent and move around comfortably. No other campers in sight, just me, alone in the quiet. It was perfect. The first night was peaceful. I set up my tent, collected some wood, and built a fire before the sun went down. The air was cool but not too cold. I ate, sat by the fire, and listened to the sounds of the forest. Crickets, the occasional rustling in the brush, the distant call of an owl. It was nice. At some point, I crawled into my tent and fell asleep. I don't know what time it was when I woke up, but something had pulled me out of my sleep. I lay there listening. The fire outside had died down to just glowing embers. The woods were silent, too silent, felt wrong. I had spent enough time outdoors to know that the forest was never completely quiet. There was always something moving, an animal, an insect, whined through the trees. But now nothing, just a heavy, suffocating silence. I told myself it was fine. I was just overthinking it. I tried to go back to sleep, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I lay there, staring at the thin fabric of my tent, barely breathing. Then I heard it. Footsteps. Not the sound of an animal moving through the underbrush, not the random creaks and groans of the forest. These were distinct, slow, deliberate. I held my breath, straining to listen. The steps stopped for a long moment, then started again, closer. My first thought was that maybe another camper had arrived late and was looking for a spot. But why would they be walking so quietly? Why would they be sneaking? I reached for my flashlight, hesitating before turning it on. My hands were shaking. The footsteps had stopped again. I sat there, heart pounding, waiting. Nothing. After a while, I convinced myself that I had imagined it. Maybe a deer had wandered close. Maybe my mind was playing tricks on me. I eventually fell back asleep, though it was a restless, uneasy sleep. The next morning, everything seemed normal again. The sun was out, birds were chirping, and the fear from the night before felt ridiculous. I told myself I had just been on edge, that the silence of the forest had freaked me out. I spent the day hiking, exploring the trails, and enjoying the solitude. By the time I returned to my campsite, the sun was already starting to dip behind the trees. I built another fire, ate, and tried to shake off the lingering unease from the night before. But when night fell, the silence returned. It happened again. The footsteps, slow, careful, closer this time. I sat up in my tent, gripping my flashlight, heart hammering in my chest. I wasn't imagining it. I forced myself to move. I unzipped the tent just enough to peek out. My fire had burned low again, just faint embers casting a weak glow. The woods beyond were black. I scanned the area, holding my breath. Nothing, but the feeling was still there. The thick, suffocating dread pressing down on me. I barely slept that night. Every sound made me flinch. Every rustle of the wind sent my heart racing. I told myself I would leave first thing in the morning. When dawn came, I packed up fast. I wasn't even hungry. I just needed to get out of there. But as I was breaking down my tent, I noticed something. Footprints. Not mine. Not from boots or hiking shoes. Bare feet. Human. And they circled my tent. I stared at them for a long time, my brain struggling to process what I was seeing. I wasn't alone out here. Someone had been watching me. Someone had been right outside my tent while I slept. I didn't waste another second. I grabbed my stuff, threw it into my backpack, and got the hell out of there. I didn't run, but I moved fast. I kept my knife in one hand, my flashlight in the other, glancing over my shoulder every few steps. When I finally reached my car, I threw my gear inside, locked the doors, and started the engine. I felt like something was watching me, just out of sight, hiding in the trees. I didn't look back. I drove straight home, my hands gripping the wheel so tight my knuckles turned white. I didn't stop until I was back in my driveway. Only then did I finally let myself breathe. I don't know who was out there. I don't know what they wanted. And I don't want to know. I haven't been camping since. I don't go camping anymore. Not after what happened. I try not to think about it, but some nights when the wind howls outside my window, I remember. The sound takes me back to that night in the woods, miles away from anyone, when I realized just how alone I truly was. It was supposed to be a simple weekend trip. Just me, my tent, and the quiet. I had been feeling restless, exhausted by the constant noise of the city. So I packed my gear and drove out to a remote campsite in a national forest. I wanted silence, fresh air, and time to think. No cell service, no distractions, just me and nature. The campsite wasn't anything special, just a clearing with a fire pit, surrounded by dense trees. The nearest trailhead was about 3 miles back, and I hadn't seen another soul since I left my truck. That was exactly what I wanted. I set up my tent, gathered some wood, and got a fire going as the sun dipped behind the trees. The sky darkened quickly, the way it does in deep wilderness, and soon, the only light came from my fire. The first few hours were peaceful. I cooked a simple meal, listened to the crackling flames, and enjoyed the stillness. The air was crisp, carrying the earthy scent of damp leaves and pine. Every now and then, I'd hear the rustling of small animals in the underbrush, but nothing unusual. I had camped alone before. I wasn't afraid, but then something changed. It was subtle at first, a feeling more than anything. The forest had been alive with natural sounds. The wind in the trees, the occasional hoot of an owl, the distant yipping of coyotes. But now there was nothing, just silence. A thick, pressing silence that settled over everything. Even the fire seemed to burn quieter. I tried to shake off the unease. Maybe it was my imagination. Maybe I was just too tired and my mind was playing tricks on me. But then I heard it. A single, deliberate snap of a twig. Close. Too close. I turned quickly, shining my flashlight toward the trees. Nothing. Just endless blackness beyond the reach of my beam. I told myself it was probably a deer, maybe a raccoon, but my gut told me otherwise. The sound hadn't come from a small animal foraging. It had been deliberate, careful. I stayed still, listening. My heartbeat suddenly loud in my ears. Minutes passed. Nothing. The silence stretched on, heavy and unnatural. Finally, I convinced myself that I was overreacting. I forced myself to relax and added more wood to the fire, letting the familiar task steady me. But the feeling never left. I decided to call it a night. I crawled into my tent, zipped the door shut, and lay down, listening. The fire outside still flickered, casting faint shadows against the fabric of my tent. I kept my knife close, just in case. Not that it would do much against the creeping dread in my chest. Then, just as my eyes started to close, I heard it again. Not a twig snapping this time. A footstep. A slow, deliberate footstep. Just beyond my tent, I stopped breathing. My fingers tightened around the knife handle. I wanted to believe it was an animal, but deep down, I knew better. I listened, straining to hear anything over the pounding of my own heart. Another step, then another. Whoever or whatever it was, they weren't rushing. They were taking their time, moving carefully, circling my tent. My mind raced. There was no reason for anyone to be out here. I hadn't seen another person all day. And even if there was some lost hiker, why wouldn't they have called out? Why were they walking so slowly, so deliberately? I didn't move. I barely breathed. My only thought was that if I stayed silent, maybe they'd go away. Maybe they'd think I was asleep and leave. Then the footsteps stopped, right next to my tent. For a moment, nothing happened. The world held its breath. Then something brushed against the fabric. Lightly, just enough to make the material shift. I gripped my knife tighter, my mind screaming at me to do something, but I was frozen. Then, as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. The presence outside my tent was gone. I didn't hear footsteps leaving. Nothing, just silence, the kind that settles deep into your bones. I don't know how long I lay there, paralyzed, listening to nothing. Minutes, hours, felt like forever, but eventually exhaustion won. I must have drifted off at some point because when I woke up, the fire was out and the sun was just beginning to rise. The world felt normal again, but I knew better. I stepped outside carefully, my muscles stiff from tension. The clearing looked the same as before, but then I saw them. Footprints. They weren't mine. They were bigger, heavier, and they circled my tent. I followed them with my eyes, my stomach twisting. They didn't just circle. They stopped, right where I had heard the presence standing in the night, right where something had brushed against the tent fabric. And then they just disappeared. There were no tracks leading away, just a clear set of prints stopping dead in the dirt. I packed up and left within minutes. I didn't care about breakfast. I didn't care about anything except getting the hell out of there. I hiked back to my truck faster than I ever had before, every shadow making my skin crawl. I never went back to that forest, never went camping alone again. I don't know who or what was out there that night. I don't want to know, but I do know one thing for certain. I wasn't alone. I had been traveling a lot for work lately, and honestly, I was exhausted. Flying from city to city and living out of a suitcase wasn't exactly glamorous, but it paid the bills. After weeks of back-to-back meetings, I finally had a break. I decided I'd rent an Airbnb in a quiet town outside the city, a small place where I could sleep, unwind, and breathe for a few days. I didn't want a hotel. I wanted something private, something that felt a little more like home. The Airbnb listing seemed perfect. A small one-bedroom guest house on the edge of town, surrounded by trees and away from the noise. The photos showed a cozy place with simple furniture, clean white walls, and big windows that let in plenty of natural light. It looked peaceful. The host, Alex, had plenty of good reviews. People described him as friendly and responsive but not intrusive. Gives you space but is there if you need him, one review said. That was exactly what I wanted. No awkward small talk with a host, just a place where I could disappear for a few days and recharge. I booked it for 4 nights. I arrived in the late afternoon. The sun was starting to set as I pulled up the long gravel driveway. The main house sat back from the road, a 2-story place with dark wood siding and a big wraparound porch. The guest house was off to the side, tucked behind a row of tall hedges. It was smaller than I'd expected, just 1 floor with a sloped roof and a little front porch. There was a key in a lockbox by the door, just like Alex had said. I punched in the code he sent me, grabbed the key, and let myself in. The place was spotless. Small but cozy, just like the photos. The living room had a couch and a small TV, and the kitchen was stocked with all the basics: pots, pans, utensils, and even some coffee and tea. There was a single bedroom with a queen-sized bed and a small bathroom with a shower. Simple, quiet, exactly what I needed. I unpacked my bag, put some groceries in the fridge, and sat on the couch for a while, just enjoying the silence. No traffic noise, no neighbors arguing through thin apartment walls, just the sound of the wind in the trees outside. That first night, I slept better than I had in weeks. The second day was uneventful. I spent most of it lounging around the house, reading and scrolling on my phone. Around noon, I went for a walk down the gravel road, enjoying the fresh air and the smell of pine trees. There were a few other houses scattered along the road, but they were far apart, separated by patches of woods. I didn't see anyone else the entire time I was out. Back at the guest house, I made myself some dinner and watched a couple of episodes of some show on Netflix. The sun went down, and the woods outside the windows turned pitch black. I thought about closing the blinds, but I kind of liked being able to see outside. It made the place feel bigger somehow. Around 11 p.m., I went to bed. That's when things started to feel off. I woke up around 2 a.m. to a strange sound. At first, I couldn't tell what it was. Just a faint noise, like something tapping on glass. I lay there in the dark, listening. The tapping stopped, then started again, softer this time. It was coming from the living room. My heart started to race. I told myself it was probably nothing, maybe a tree branch brushing against the window. I got out of bed, my feet cold against the hardwood floor, and crept toward the living room. The tapping stopped as soon as I stepped into the room. I stood there for a few seconds, staring at the window. Nothing, just my own reflection in the glass. I felt stupid. Of course it was nothing. I was in the middle of nowhere. It was probably just the wind. I went back to bed. The next morning, I tried to forget about it. I told myself I was just being paranoid. I'd been stressed and overtired, and my brain was playing tricks on me. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I spent most of the day inside, trying to focus on my book, but my eyes kept drifting to the windows. Every time I looked outside, I half expected to see someone standing there, watching me, but there was never anyone there. That night, it happened again. I woke up to the same tapping sound, only this time it was louder, more insistent. I sat up in bed, my heart pounding. The sound was coming from the same window in the living room. I grabbed my phone and turned on the flashlight. The beam of light cut through the darkness as I made my way toward the living room. The tapping stopped just before I reached the window. I shined the light outside, but all I could see was my own reflection staring back at me. Then I noticed something. The lock on the front door. It was unlocked. I was sure I had locked it before I went to bed. A chill ran down my spine. I locked the door again and double-checked all the windows. Everything else was secure. I told myself I must have forgotten to lock the door earlier. I was tired, distracted. It was an honest mistake. But deep down, I didn't believe that. The next day, I called Alex. I didn't tell him everything, just that I thought someone might have tried to get into the guest house during the night. He seemed concerned and promised to come by later to check things out. He never showed up. I tried calling him again, but it went straight to voicemail. By the time the sun went down, I was on edge. Every little noise made me jump. The wind outside sounded like footsteps. The creak of the floorboards sounded like someone moving through the house. I locked the door and propped a chair under the doorknob, just to be safe. Then I sat on the couch with my phone in my hand, watching the front door. Hours passed. Nothing happened. Around midnight, I finally started to relax. I told myself I was being ridiculous, and then the power went out. The TV flickered off, plunging the room into darkness. For a second, I just sat there, frozen. My phone was the only source of light. I turned on the flashlight again and got up to check the breaker box. It was in a small closet in the hallway. I opened the door and shined the light inside. All the switches were in the on position. That's when I heard it. A soft click. The sound of the front door unlocking. I didn't think. I just ran. I sprinted out the back door and into the woods, my bare feet slipping on the wet grass. I didn't stop until I was deep in the trees, far enough that I couldn't see the guest house anymore. I crouched behind a tree, trying to catch my breath. My heart was pounding so hard it felt like it might burst out of my chest. I stayed there for what felt like hours, listening, waiting. Finally, I worked up the courage to peek back toward the house. The front door was wide open. A man was standing in the doorway, his face hidden in shadow. He didn't move. He just stood there, staring out into the darkness, like he was waiting for something, or someone. I stayed in the woods until dawn. When the sun came up, the man was gone. The front door was closed. I ran back to the house, grabbed my bag and my keys, and got the hell out of there. I never looked back. I reported everything to Airbnb and the local police, but they never found anything. Alex never responded to my messages. His profile disappeared from the site a few days later. To this day, I have no idea who that man was or what he wanted. All I know is I'll never stay in an Airbnb again. I booked the Airbnb because it seemed perfect. A quiet house in a small, out-of-the-way town, surrounded by woods. It had 5-star reviews, and the host was responsive and friendly. I needed a break from the city, and this seemed like the perfect escape. A weekend to reset, with no traffic noise, no emails, and no one knocking on my door. The pictures showed a cozy little house. Wooden floors, big windows, a front porch with a couple of chairs for sipping morning coffee. Nothing fancy, but clean and charming. Exactly what I needed. I left on a Friday after work, driving about 3 hours through highways that gradually turned into narrow, twisting roads lined with trees. The town, if you could call it that, was little more than a main street with a gas station, a diner, and a general store. My phone signal flickered in and out as I drove past. I reached the house just as the sun was setting. The Airbnb was at the end of a gravel road, partially hidden by thick trees. It looked just like the pictures. A small, single-story house with weathered wood siding and a front porch that creaked slightly when I stepped on it. I stood there for a moment, breathing in the fresh air. The woods surrounding the house were dense and dark, the trees swaying gently in the evening breeze. I unlocked the door with the code the host had sent me. Inside, it smelled faintly of wood and old books. The floors creaked as I walked through, my footsteps echoing in the quiet. The living room was cozy, with a worn couch, a coffee table covered in magazines, and a fireplace that looked like it hadn't been used in a while. There was a small kitchen with outdated appliances and a single bedroom with a queen-sized bed and a thick quilt. Everything was just as advertised, simple and peaceful. I unpacked my bag, put some groceries in the fridge, and made myself a quick dinner. After eating, I settled on the couch with a book. The only sound in the house, the soft hum of the fridge and the occasional creak of the old wooden frame. The first night was uneventful. I slept deeply, waking up only once when I thought I heard something outside. It was probably an animal, a raccoon or a deer, but it startled me enough that I got out of bed and peered out the window. The yard was empty, just shadows from the trees swaying in the moonlight. I went back to bed and fell asleep almost immediately. The next morning, I made coffee and sat on the porch, listening to the birds and watching the sun rise over the trees. It was peaceful, exactly what I had hoped for. I spent most of the day reading, walking through the woods behind the house, and just enjoying the silence. The air smelled fresh and earthy, and the only sounds were the rustling leaves and the distant call of birds. By late afternoon, clouds began to gather, and the light drizzle quickly turned into a steady rain. I retreated inside, lighting a few candles and curling up on the couch with my book. The rain tapped softly against the windows, and the house felt warm and cozy. It was around 8 p.m. when I noticed something strange. I had gone into the bedroom to grab my phone charger and realized the window was open, not just unlocked, open wide, letting in the cool, damp air. I was sure I hadn't opened it. I remembered checking the windows when I arrived, making sure everything was secure. A chill ran down my spine, but I brushed it off. Maybe I had opened it earlier and forgotten, or maybe it hadn't latched properly and the wind pushed it open. It was an old house after all. I closed the window, locked it, and made a mental note to check the others. I spent the rest of the evening on the couch, trying to focus on my book but feeling distracted. Every creak of the house felt louder than it should have, every shadow stretching a little too far. At around 11 p.m., I decided to call it a night. I checked all the windows and doors again, making sure they were locked. Satisfied, I turned off the lights and crawled into bed. I woke up in the middle of the night, heart racing. At first, I didn't know why. The house was silent, the kind of deep, oppressive silence that makes your ears strain for any sound. I lay there, listening, my eyes adjusting to the darkness. Then I heard it. A faint creak, like a footstep on the wooden floor, came from the living room. I held my breath, every muscle in my body tensing. Maybe it was the house settling, I told myself, or an animal on the porch. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. I listened, straining to hear more. Another creak, closer this time. My mind raced. I hadn't heard a car pull up, and there was no reason anyone would be out here in the middle of the night. I reached for my phone on the nightstand, my fingers trembling. No signal. Of course. I cursed under my breath, trying to think. Another sound. This time, it was unmistakable. The soft thud of a footstep, right outside the bedroom door. I felt a surge of adrenaline, my heartbeat hammering in my ears. I needed to move, to do something. But what? There was no lock on the bedroom door, and the only way out was through the living room. I slid out of bed as quietly as I could, my bare feet pressing into the cold floor. I grabbed the closest thing I could find, a heavy flashlight from the nightstand, and crept toward the door. My pulse pounded in my throat as I pressed my ear to the wood. Silence. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, waiting, listening. Finally, I took a deep breath and opened the door, holding the flashlight like a weapon. The living room was dark, the faint glow of moonlight filtering through the curtains. It was empty. I walked through the house, checking every corner, every closet. Nothing. The front door was still locked, the windows still shut. There was no sign of anyone. I tried to tell myself I had imagined it, that I was just jumpy from being alone in an unfamiliar place. But it felt too real. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been there. I slept with the flashlight in my hand that night, barely dozing, every creak and groan of the house setting me on edge. The next morning, I considered leaving. I even packed up my bag, ready to cut the trip short. But I felt silly. What would I tell the host? That I got scared because of some noises in the night? It was probably just the house settling or an animal outside. I decided to stay, but I couldn't shake the unease. I spent the day close to the house, checking my phone for a signal every few minutes. By late afternoon, the clouds returned and the rain started again. That night, I locked everything up as tightly as I could. I double-checked the windows and doors, making sure everything was secure. Then I settled on the couch with a movie, trying to distract myself. Around 10 p.m., the power went out. The house plunged into darkness, the hum of the fridge and the soft glow of the lamps vanishing in an instant. I sat there for a moment, my eyes adjusting to the dark. I grabbed the flashlight from the coffee table and turned it on, the beam cutting through the darkness. I decided to wait it out, hoping the power would come back soon. But as the minutes stretched into an hour, the silence became unbearable. I could hear every creak, every drip of rainwater against the windows. Then, somewhere outside, I heard it, a soft, deliberate knock. I froze. The knock came again, louder this time. 3 steady taps, like someone was testing the door. My heart was in my throat. I pointed the flashlight toward the front door, the beam illuminating the wooden frame. I couldn't see anyone through the window. The knock came again. I stood up, my legs shaky. I crept toward the door, my fingers tightening around the flashlight. When I reached it, I hesitated, my breath caught in my chest. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice barely above a whisper. Silence. I waited, listening, the rain tapping softly against the roof. Then, just as I was about to turn away, I heard footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps walking away from the house. I stood there for a long time, listening, waiting for them to come back. But they never did. I didn't sleep that night. I sat on the couch, the flashlight in my lap. Every light in the house turned on as soon as the power returned. I watched the windows, waiting for the figure to return, but the woods remained dark and empty. By morning, I had made up my mind. I packed my things and left without looking back. I didn't care if the host thought I was crazy or if I lost the money for the last night. I just needed to get out of there. Driving away, I felt a sense of relief wash over me. The further I got from the house, the lighter I felt. But even now, weeks later, I can't shake the feeling that someone was watching me that weekend. Someone who knew I was alone.